pathway is the lateral spinal thalamic pathway. There is also an anterior spinal thalamic pathway that carries the same information. It runs up in the anterior spinal cord instead of the lateral spinal cord. Does the same thing, goes to the same place. So we're not going to do this information twice. Okay? This is the more common one. So we're going to do the lateral spinal thalamic pathway. So do a little erasing here. You can just move to the next page. This pathway has no medial lemniscus. That's only found as part of the posterior column pathway. So pain, touch, and temperature. Okay, crude touch, when I say touch, not the discriminative touch, just pressure. All right, something pressing on you, but you don't know, you can't really define what the object is. This also follows our same rules. So we have 3 neurons. So we have a primary neuron coming, say, from a pain receptor. Its cell body, along with all the other sensory neurons, forms the dorsal root ganglion. And it enters into the posterior gray horn, and that's where it stops. All right. So the posterior column pathway, the first order neuron went all the way up the spinal cord. And this one, it stops in the posterior gray horn. And that is where it synapses with the second order neuron. So the posterior gray horn is going to have the second order neuron, is why it's gray matter. And this neuron is going to go, it's a second order neuron, so it has to go from the spinal cord all the way up to the thalamus. All right? It's going to cross. It's going to cross over in the anterior white commissure. And it's going to ascend in the lateral white column, pass up through the medulla, pass through the pons, pass through the midbrain, and end in the thalamus as well. So we're not going to, this one, we're not going to label the nucleus cuneatus and gracilis because that's not a part of this pathway. But we will name the anterior white commissure. We'll put AWC. Okay?
Can we abbreviate on the test?
No. You know better than that. All right, so no medial lemniscus. But it's still the second order neuron. Okay. So if I have a lesion in my spinal cord, will I be losing, down here, if I have a lesion in my spinal cord, will I be losing pain, touch, and temperature on the same side of the lesion or the opposite side? It's already crossed over. So it will be, go back to where the stimuli was, and I'm not going to be able to process that stimuli. That's on the opposite side of my lesion, so it would be a contralateral loss. Okay? What about if I damage my posterior spinal cord? Will the loss of discriminative touch be contralateral or ipsilateral? Posterior white column, first pathway we just did. Has it crossed over yet? No. So then it would be ipsilateral. Okay? So if the information is being carried on the same side as the origin of the stimulus, and we have a lesion, then we're going to lose that sensation the same side as the lesion. That's ipsilateral. So the deficit loss is ipsilateral to the lesion, same side as. If the lesion occurs after the information is crossed over, my lesion is here, my loss of pain, touch, and temperature is on the opposite side of that lesion, so it's contralateral. Okay? Third order neurons form the nuclei of the thalamus, so that's going to be the same. Okay? No longer the posterior column pathway. This is lateral spinothalamic. Now, if I did not show you the pathway and I just said identify spinothalamic as a sensory or a motor pathway, you can see it in the name. It's going from the spinal cord up through the thalamus. It's ascending. And all ascending pathways are sensory. Okay?
Oops. I meant
That's
sensory.
still true.
I meant sensory.
This is still going to go to the postcentral gyrus. It's just going to go to different cell bodies for processing. All right? It's the cell bodies that process pain, or the cell bodies that process temperature or proprioception are still in the postcentral gyrus. They're just different neurons. Okay? And then our last sensory pathway. Only 45 minutes. So we're going to do 3 sensory, and then on Tuesday we're going to do 5 motor. Okay. The motor are all descending. 2 of them are going to come from the cortex and go to the brainstem for trigeminal, or go to the abducens. Some of them will start in the midbrain. And if it starts in the midbrain, do you have conscious control over it? If the upper motor neuron has its cell body in the midbrain? No. So these are for unconscious control of posture and such. This pathway is similar in the reverse. It doesn't go all the way up to the brain. So this pathway, the spinal cerebellar pathway, is carrying information from the spinal cord only to the cerebellum, which doesn't process it so that you consciously recognize it, but it's carrying the same kind of information as the posterior white column. It's carrying joint sense. So the spinal cerebellar pathway is for unconscious. It doesn't mean it only works when you're asleep. Okay, it means that it doesn't get to your conscious recognition. So it's unconscious processing of proprioception or joint sense. So remember, the cerebellum coordinates what your joints are doing with what your muscles are going to do. So how does that information get from your joints to your cerebellum? Which of the cerebellar peduncles does it use? What were the names of our 3 cerebellar peduncles? They're on the quiz today. Superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. All right? So we're using inferior cerebellar peduncle to get the sensory information to the cerebellum. So the first order neuron is the same as before. It's going to come in. This time I'm going to change it though. I'm going to do it differently from the slide. We're going to bring it to, let's say it's coming in from the back. If it's coming in from the back, the deep back from your muscles of your vertebra and the joints of your vertebra, it's going to come in through the dorsal ramus. Just to move things around a bit. Its cell body is still going to be in the dorsal root ganglion. And it's going to stop in the posterior gray horn. And this is one of those exceptions to the second order neuron crossing. The other exception was some of the second order neurons in the retina and the optic nerve. So this neuron doesn't cross. It stays on the same side. and it ascends up the spinal cord. Actually, I need to move it out to the lateral white column. Ascends up the spinal cord, through the medulla, to the cerebellum. And the structure that it leaves the medulla through is the inferior cerebellar, not cerebral, cerebral's in the midbrain, cerebellar peduncle. Okay. So first order neuron comes in same way, through the dorsal root, into the spinal cord, synapses with the second order neuron in the posterior gray horn. That stays on the same side and ascends, passes out of the medulla through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to get to the cerebellum. And does not go to the thalamus. So this is a second order neuron pathway only. And how is the cerebellum going to use that information? It's going to adjust the next movement that you make based on the information it's getting. I deliberately didn't use the word know, because the cerebellum doesn't consciously know anything. But it's going to use that information of where your joints are to adjust the information it's getting about the movement that you're going to do and to modify that. All right? So that's part of the descending. That information coming through the middle cerebellar peduncle is a motor pathway. And this is the information getting to the cerebellum as a sensory pathway. So it is and again, you can tell by the name, spinal cord to cerebellum. Okay. Now, if we look at a cross section of the spinal cord, that's one that was corrupted. So you'll see in the chapter on integrative pathways, this mapping of a cross-section of the spinal cord. I'm not going to have you identify these components. I didn't talk about this when we did a cross-section of the spinal cord because I didn't want to confuse you because we hadn't talked about these pathways yet. All right? But fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. Fasciculus is just the more Latin term for column. So it's the same thing. We don't use those specifically. We just talk about the nuclei associated with them, so I didn't divide the posterior column into those separate columns. But posterior column pathway is shown here. The green is showing the lateral spinal thalamic tract or pathway. Here is the anterior spinal thalamic tract. Okay? Then these are the anterior and posterior spinal cerebellar pathways or tracts. We just did it as a spinal cerebellar. We didn't worry about anterior, posterior. The ones that are not shown, that we're going to talk about on Tuesday, are motor pathways. Remember I said the posterior column, white column, is all sensory? And there it is, all sensory. Lateral white column is mixed. It's both. So here's the sensory, here's the motor. Both sensory and motor. But notice they're not blended together. They're discrete pathways. So in the spinal nerves, all those sensory motor fibers are going to be mixed up. But when they're in the spinal cord or the brainstem, they're distinct. I have a whole pathway that is ascending for pain, touch, and temperature, another pathway that is descending for motor. All right? Same with the anterior white column. It has both sensory and motor tracts. Okay? That's the end of that lecture today. So